In the vast and brutal expanse of the Second World War, there were moments so improbable, so close to the edge of human endurance and mechanical failure, that they seemed to disappear into the shadows of larger battles and grand strategies. Yet these moments, lived in the cramped space of bomber cockpits and written in trembling lines of mission logs, reveal more about courage than any sweeping account of armies in motion. One such moment occurred high above hostile territory, when a crew faced a fire no manual could extinguish and a decision no training syllabus had prepared them for. Their aircraft, scarred by flak, heavy with fatigue, and running out of time, carried not only the threat of disaster but the weight of every life on board. Flames spread along the wing, devouring metal with a cold inevitability. Standard procedures failed. Extinguishers failed. Altitude dwindled. There was no pathway left except the one that seemed impossible. What happened next would be spoken of quietly, almost reluctantly, by the men who lived through it, and preserved only in the understated language of wartime records. A pilot made a choice that defied the limits of his aircraft and the conventions of his trade. He inverted a fully loaded bomber in mid-flight to smother the fire with the wind itself. It was a maneuver born not of daring, but necessity, not of recklessness, but of the disciplined clarity forged in war's most unforgiving moments. And it worked. This is the story of that crew, that decision, and the fragile line between loss and survival they crossed together. The story of the crew that inverted their aircraft in mid-flight to extinguish an onboard fire stands as one of the lesser-known yet profoundly revealing episodes of the Second World War, illustrating the convergence of training, circumstance, discipline, and an unyielding commitment to survival and duty. Although overshadowed by larger, more publicized operations of the war, this event, recorded in squadron logs and preserved in scattered personal accounts, offers a rare glimpse into the extreme pressures faced by air crews of the period. It demonstrates how their actions, though sometimes bordering on the impossible, were shaped not by recklessness but by a sober calculus of necessity during a time when every second brought the possibility of catastrophe. The incident occurred within the broader context of the Allied strategic bombing campaign, a vast and grueling effort that forced thousands of airmen into conditions of cold, darkness, anti-aircraft fire, and mechanical uncertainty, testing both machinery and human endurance to the very limit. Understanding this singular event requires an understanding of that environment, one in which the extraordinary became not merely conceivable but, at times, the only available course of action. The demands placed upon flight crews during the war were immense. Aircraft were often flown at the edge of their performance envelopes, heavily loaded with fuel and explosives, and subject to rapidly shifting weather conditions. Mechanical failures were common, and maintenance crews worked continuously to keep worn aircraft in service despite scarcity of parts and the limitations of wartime production. Each mission was prepared with meticulous planning, yet the inherent unpredictability of combat meant that air crews often faced situations that no manual could fully anticipate. Training emphasized procedural discipline, but it also required the kind of adaptability and calm decision-making that could only be learned from experience. It was within this framework that the incident took place, a crew trained within the standards of the time, seasoned enough to understand the gravity of emergencies, and unified by the kind of camaraderie forged through successive sorties into enemy territory. The aircraft involved was a twin-engine medium bomber typical of Allied forces in the European theater during the mid-war years. Its design reflected a balance between speed, payload, and defensive capability, but like all aircraft of the era, it was vulnerable to engine fires, fuel leaks, and damage from both ground fire and hostile fighters. The engines, reliable under normal circumstances, could become volatile when overstressed or compromised by damage. Fire in a wing nacelle was among the most feared emergencies. Not only could it rapidly consume the engine and compromise structural components, but it also risked igniting the fuel system, turning a controlled flight into an uncontrollable descent. Standard procedure dictated immediate attempts to shut down the affected engine, cut off fuel supply, and deploy onboard extinguishing systems. However, if the fire spread beyond a certain point or ignited fuel on the surface of the wing, extinguishers could prove insufficient. In such circumstances, survival depended on either rapid descent to allow airflow to suppress the flames or the drastic step of abandoning the aircraft if altitude permitted. The crew that faced this perilous situation had already flown numerous sorties by the time of the incident. They were not novices, nor were they immune to fear, rather, they possessed a measured, experienced understanding of the dangers inherent to each mission. Their responsibilities were clearly divided, yet their survival depended on the collective functioning of the group. Pilots, navigator, bombardier, radioman, gunners, each role was essential, and each member was acutely aware of how quickly an error, even a minor one, could escalate into disaster. Their aircraft had been recently serviced, though wartime records reveal that shortages of spare parts had forced ground crews to make do with repaired components and improvised adjustments. The engines, though tested before the mission, had accrued many operational hours, and signs of wear had been noted in earlier maintenance logs. None of this was unusual, it was simply part of daily life in a wartime air force. The mission on which the event unfolded began like many others: a briefing at dawn, distribution of target reconnaissance materials, weather reports that predicted turbulence and cloud cover, and intelligence updates regarding enemy defenses. The crew approached their aircraft with the habitual solemnity of those who had done so many times before, carrying out their pre-flight checks with thorough professionalism. As the engines were started and warmed up, the familiar vibrations passed through the fuselage, and the crew settled into their positions, each man adjusting equipment, running through procedural checks, and preparing mentally for the hours ahead. They took off in formation with other aircraft from their squadron, climbing steadily into the morning sky as the base diminished behind them. For much of the outbound flight, conditions were routine. The weather, though unsettled, remained manageable, and visibility fluctuated but did not present serious navigational difficulty. At cruising altitude, the formation spread out to accommodate varying engine performance among individual aircraft. As they progressed toward enemy-held territory, radio discipline was maintained, with minimal communication beyond essential navigational updates. The aircraft's engines operated steadily, though later accounts note that a faint but persistent vibration had been detected in the port engine, a detail that in retrospect suggested underlying mechanical stress. At the time, however, the vibration fell within expected tolerances, and the crew, conditioned by wartime experience, accepted it without undue concern. The attack run was executed according to plan. The aircraft descended to operational height, navigated through cloud breaks, and released its payload with calculated precision. Enemy anti-aircraft fire was present but not exceptionally heavy by the standards of the period. Nonetheless, several near misses jarred the aircraft, and fragments from exploding shells rattled against the fuselage and wings. The crew maintained course until the release confirmation was acknowledged, after which they initiated the long return flight. It was during this phase, after the bombing run had been completed and the formation had begun its withdrawal, that the situation began to deteriorate. Initially, the anomaly appeared minor, a slight drop in manifold pressure in the port engine, followed by a momentary fluctuation in RPM. These indicators were not uncommon following heavy maneuvers or exposure to flak bursts, and the pilot monitored the gauges while keeping the aircraft steady. Within minutes, however, a faint trail of smoke became visible along the wing. The radioman, monitoring visually through his position window, reported the smoke to the pilot, who responded with immediate checks of fuel flow, oil temperature, and cylinder head readings. The port engine was running hot, significantly above operational norms. This prompted the execution of emergency procedures, adjusting mixture, reducing throttle, and preparing to feather the propeller if necessary. Before these measures could stabilize the situation, the smoke intensified, darkening into the unmistakable signature of an engine fire. Flames were soon visible along the rear of the nacelle, fed either by ruptured fuel lines or by oil igniting on contact with hot engine components. The pilot shut off the fuel supply to the engine, activated the built-in extinguishing system, and instructed the crew to prepare for possible abandonment. The extinguishing system deployed as intended, dispersing the pressurized agent into the nacelle, but the fire continued to burn. In many such circumstances, the heat would weaken structural supports or spread through the wing, eventually making controlled flight impossible. The crew faced the urgent problem of preventing the fire from engulfing the wing. Loss of the wing would result in a catastrophic failure, leaving no chance for recovery or bailout. The pilot and co-pilot weighed their diminishing options, descending rapidly in the hope that increased airflow would extinguish the flames, stabilizing the aircraft long enough for the crew to bail out over hostile territory, or attempting a hazardous return flight on one engine while monitoring the fire. But the flames, intensifying despite extinguishers, indicated an immediate risk of fuel ignition. If the fuel tanks caught fire, the aircraft would not remain intact long enough for any survival strategy. The decisive moment came when the pilot realized that airflow around the nacelle could be used not merely to cool but to suffocate the flames if directed properly. Under conventional circumstances, airflow passed over the top surface of the wing during level flight. If the aircraft were inverted, however, the airflow patterns would change. Air would rush downward across what was normally the underside of the wing, potentially depriving the fire of oxygen or at least reducing its ability to spread. Inverting a multi-engine bomber was not standard procedure and carried immense risks, especially with one engine already compromised. The maneuver required precision and a degree of control that would be challenging even in a fully functional aircraft. Nonetheless, all other options appeared insufficient to mitigate the fire quickly enough to prevent structural failure. Aircraft of the period were not designed for prolonged inverted flight. Their fuel and oil systems, controls, and structural tolerances were engineered for upright operation with only brief inverted maneuvers permitted during training or emergency evasive action. Inverting a medium bomber risked engine starvation, control difficulties, and abrupt loss of altitude. Yet the pilot, assessing the worsening fire and the lack of alternatives, decided that the maneuver offered the only viable chance of saving the aircraft and crew. The decision was executed without hesitation but with the grounded seriousness of one who understood both the necessity and the peril. As the pilot initiated the roll, the aircraft responded sluggishly, compromised by the drag of the damaged engine and the weight distribution of the fuel and bomb bay remnants. The roll placed substantial stress on the airframe, and the crew braced themselves as the horizon inverted and gravity pulled them against their harnesses in unfamiliar directions. Loose equipment shifted, and the airflow through the fuselage changed pitch, creating a brief but disorienting moment. Yet the roll continued until the aircraft was fully inverted. In this inverted position, airflow struck the burning nacelle at a different angle. Flames that had been trailing upward now struggled against the downward airflow. Reports from the crew described the flames flattening and then diminishing as the oxygen supply was disrupted. The intensity of the fire decreased significantly within seconds, though it did not extinguish immediately. The pilot, maintaining as steady an inverted flight path as possible, held the aircraft in this position despite the strain on the surviving engine and the growing difficulty in maintaining altitude. Gradually, the flames subsided. The intense glow within the nacelle faded, replaced first by glowing embers and then by smoke. The danger of immediate explosion diminished, though structural damage remained a pressing concern. After holding inversion long enough to ensure the flames had extinguished fully, the pilot initiated the maneuver to roll the aircraft back to its upright position. This required careful coordination to avoid overstressing the weakened wing or losing control due to asymmetric thrust. With steady application of control inputs, the aircraft completed the roll and returned to level flight. Once upright, the crew assessed the damage. The port engine was beyond use, its external cowling charred and distorted. The wing surface near the nacelle bore burn marks and apparent buckling, though it remained attached. The pilot trimmed the aircraft to compensate for single-engine operation and evaluated the remaining fuel reserves. The loss of one engine significantly reduced speed and altitude capacity, and the aircraft could not maintain the same flight profile as the rest of the returning formation. A decision was made to divert to the nearest Allied controlled airfield rather than risk attempting the full return to their original base. The diversion involved flying over contested territory with limited speed and maneuverability, an extremely vulnerable position. Enemy fighters, had they been present, would have easily exploited the crippled bomber. Fortunately, the airspace was relatively quiet at that phase of the mission, and cloud cover provided partial concealment. The navigator recalculated headings based on the altered performance characteristics of the aircraft, while the radioman monitored emergency frequencies in case of further breakdowns. The crew maintained constant vigilance for additional hazards, aware that any further mechanical failure could prove fatal. The approach to the diversion airfield was tense. Landing a twin-engine bomber on one engine was feasible but required precise alignment, careful throttle control, and anticipation of asymmetric thrust during descent. Furthermore, the structural integrity of the wing remained uncertain, and the pilot avoided steep banking turns that might overstress the damaged section. The airfield had been informed of their situation through emergency radio transmission, and ground crews prepared for a potential crash landing. Yet the approach remained stable, and the pilot executed a controlled descent, holding the aircraft steady as it settled toward the runway. The landing, though rough, succeeded without collapse of the landing gear or failure of the damaged wing. As the aircraft rolled to a halt, medical personnel and fire crews approached, prepared for injuries or reignition, but the crew emerged shaken yet unharmed. Ground engineers examined the wing and engine nacelle, confirming that the fire had severely weakened structural components and that continued flight would have been impossible. The decision to invert the aircraft had prevented the fire from spreading further and had effectively saved the crew from a catastrophic mid-air breakup. In the immediate aftermath, the incident was recorded in squadron logs with the dry precision typical of military documentation. The technical details were noted, the actions of the pilot and crew acknowledged, and the aircraft classified as in need of extensive repair. However, the emotional weight of the event, what it meant to the men who had lived through it, was not captured in those logs. Wartime records rarely documented fear, relief, or the internal strain borne by air crews. Yet personal recollections, later shared privately or preserved in interviews decades after the war, reveal how profoundly the event shaped their understanding of survival and duty. For the crew, the inversion maneuver was not an act of daring but a decision born from necessity, carried out with the calm focus of individuals who understood that their lives depended on immediate and decisive action. The incident, though not widely publicized, circulated within flight training circles as an example of unconventional yet effective emergency response. It reinforced the principle that procedures, while essential, could not fully encompass the range of scenarios encountered in combat. Pilots were trained to rely on discipline, but also to adapt when circumstances demanded solutions beyond standard doctrine. The inversion maneuver, while extraordinary, was not framed as recklessness but as the calculated action of a pilot who recognized that strict adherence to conventional procedures would have resulted in the loss of both crew and aircraft. As months passed and the war continued, the crew returned to operational duties after a period of rest and reassignment. Their damaged aircraft was eventually repaired but reassigned to other units, while the crew transitioned to a different aircraft within their squadron. Their experience, though unique, blended into the collective memory shared by airmen who had faced equally dire emergencies. The war allowed little time for reflection, and each mission demanded renewed focus. Nonetheless, the memory of the inversion remained an enduring testament to their resilience and determination. Their actions reflected a broader truth about the air war, that survival depended not only on machinery and training but on the ability of crews to respond to unforeseen crises with calm judgment. The aviation technology of the era, though advanced for its time, lacked many of the safeguards that modern aircraft possess. Fire suppression systems were limited, cockpit instrumentation lacked the redundancy expected today, and structural vulnerabilities were well known to engineers and pilots alike. Aircrews compensated for these limitations through collective experience, rigorous training, and a deep sense of responsibility toward one another. The story reached official recognition in the form of commendations awarded to the pilot and crew, acknowledging their bravery and extraordinary airmanship. These commendations, while formal in language, reflected an institutional awareness of the exceptional nature of their actions. Yet the crew remained modest in recounting the event, emphasizing that survival had been their sole objective and that any crew in their position would have acted similarly. This humility was characteristic of many veterans of the air war, who viewed their experiences not as heroic but as necessary responses to circumstances no one could fully control. The incident offers valuable insight into the psychology of wartime air crews. They operated within an environment of constant tension, balancing routine procedures with the knowledge that emergencies could arise without warning. This combination fostered a mentality in which fear coexisted with calm discipline, and where decisive action became second nature. The inversion maneuver, although dramatic, represented the culmination of this mindset, a willingness to employ unconventional solutions grounded in an intimate understanding of their aircraft and its capabilities. Understanding the broader context of the war further illuminates why such actions, though uncommon, were possible. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was a massive undertaking involving thousands of personnel, vast logistical networks, and an evolving tactical doctrine. Crews flew long missions across heavily defended airspace, often at night or in adverse weather conditions. Losses were high, and survival depended on both collective effort and individual initiative. Each crew developed a unique cohesion through shared experiences, shaping how they responded to crises. The bond among crew members, forged through hours spent in confined, stressful conditions, fostered trust that each man would perform his duties with precision, even in moments of extreme danger. Technical aspects of the incident also merit careful consideration. The aircraft's airframe, though designed primarily for upright flight, possessed structural tolerances that allowed for brief inverted maneuvers without immediate failure. Engineers of the era recognized that combat conditions could force aircraft into unusual attitudes, and thus incorporated safety margins into the design. Nonetheless, maintaining inverted flight for extended periods exceeded normal parameters and placed unusual stress on fuel lines, lubrication systems, and control linkages. The fact that the aircraft withstood these stresses long enough to extinguish the fire speaks to both the robustness of its construction and the pilot's skill in managing control inputs to minimize additional strain. Equally significant is the role of crew coordination during the emergency. The navigator recalculated potential diversion routes, the radioman maintained communication discipline, and the gunner secured equipment during the inversion to prevent hazards caused by shifting weight. Each crew member performed their functions with clarity and composure, contributing to the successful resolution of the crisis. Their actions exemplify the teamwork essential to bomber operations during the war, where each role was interdependent and crucial to survival. The psychological aftermath of the event, though less documented, reveals the lasting impact such experiences had on air crews. Veterans later described the incident not as a moment of panic but as a period of intense focus, during which the urgency of the situation narrowed their attention to the tasks at hand. Only after landing and leaving the aircraft did the full weight of what they had undergone become apparent. This pattern of delayed emotional response was common among aircrew veterans, who often compartmentalized fear in order to function effectively during missions. The inversion maneuver became part of their shared narrative, occasionally recounted but never exaggerated, and always with the sober awareness of how close they had come to disaster. In the years following the war, the incident faded from public attention, overshadowed by more widely publicized acts of heroism and by the broader narrative of the air campaign. Yet within certain circles, among aviation historians, flight instructors, and veterans, the story persisted as an example of extraordinary airmanship. It served as a reminder that even in an era defined by mass mobilization and industrial warfare, individual decisions and actions could dramatically alter the outcome of a single moment, preserving lives that might otherwise have been lost. The legacy of the crew's actions extends beyond the incident itself. Their decision to invert the aircraft represents the kind of critical thinking that wartime aviators were often compelled to exercise. While manuals provided guidelines, they could not predict every combination of damage, weather, and mechanical failure. Pilots were trained to respect procedure but also to improvise when necessary. The inversion maneuver, though unconventional, aligned with the underlying principles of emergency response, contain the threat, preserve the aircraft if possible, and protect the lives of those aboard. In this sense, their actions reflect the deeper ethos of aircrews during the war, a blend of discipline, experience, and ingenuity. The precise details of the fire, including its ignition source, were later analyzed by engineering teams. Their conclusion was that damage from anti-aircraft shell fragments had ruptured oil lines within the nacelle, resulting in ignition upon contact with hot surfaces. The fire suppression system, though functioning as designed, could not fully extinguish the flames due to the extent of structural rupture. This assessment confirmed that the crew's actions had addressed a situation that exceeded the capabilities of standard equipment. The inversion, by altering airflow and oxygen supply, had accomplished what mechanical systems alone could not. Historical records indicate that similar maneuvers, though rare, were attempted by a few other crews across different theaters of the war, often with varying degrees of success. However, the incident described here stands out for its thorough documentation and for the complete survival of both crew and aircraft. This distinguishes it within the broader category of improvised emergency responses in wartime aviation, offering a clear example of how pilots sometimes employed extreme measures in the face of overwhelming danger. The crew members themselves went on to lead varied post-war lives. Some returned to civilian aviation, bringing with them the lessons learned during the war. Others pursued different careers, though they carried memories of their wartime service throughout their lives. Their experience during the inversion incident shaped their understanding of risk, responsibility, and the fragility of survival. In interviews conducted decades later, surviving members emphasized not the technical daring of the maneuver but the profound gratitude they felt for having returned alive. Their recollections convey a deep respect for their comrades and for the countless others who faced similar dangers but did not return. In the months that followed the incident, the diversion airfield where the crew had landed became a temporary home for them. The airframe they had saved was transported to a maintenance depot for structural analysis, revealing in full the extent of the damage sustained during the fire and the inversion maneuver. Engineers documented warped supports, scorched surfaces, and evidence of heat that had penetrated dangerously close to the wing spar. Their assessments confirmed that only minutes had separated the aircraft from structural failure. The engineering reports, though technical in wording, implicitly acknowledged that the survival of the crew had depended not on equipment alone but on the decisions made by the pilot and the coordinated discipline of the men at their stations. This recognition was shared quietly among those who worked on the airframe, many of whom had served long enough to know how seldom an aircraft returned intact after sustaining that level of damage. The crew's temporary reassignment at the diversion airfield provided them with a rare period of enforced rest. Yet rest in wartime was always relative. They continued to assist in operations at the base, helped other crews prepare for missions, and, those who were technically proficient, offered insights to mechanics and instructors about their experience. Their reports were included in training supplements circulated discreetly among aircrew schools, highlighting the importance of understanding airflow dynamics during emergencies. These instructional materials, while not formally altering doctrine, encouraged pilots to think beyond rigid procedures in life-or-death situations. The story of an aircraft being inverted to extinguish a fire was presented without embellishment, framed as a rare but valid use of aerodynamic principles when conventional systems failed. During this period, the crew underwent medical evaluations to ensure they were fit for return to operational duties. Their physical health was sound despite the stress of the incident, though post-flight assessments noted elevated fatigue levels and signs of accumulated operational strain, findings common among airmen at that stage of the war. The psychological impact, while more difficult to quantify, was addressed through conversations with officers trained to evaluate a crew's readiness. These evaluations revealed a crew united not solely by shared trauma but by reinforced trust in one another. They had confronted a situation that could have separated them permanently, yet their coordinated actions had ensured that they all walked away together. This unity was recognized as an essential quality for crews returning to frontline operations. When their evaluations were complete and a new aircraft assigned, the crew returned to their original squadron. Their reception was respectful yet understated, reflecting the culture of wartime aviation communities, where survival of one mission simply meant readiness for the next. Stories circulated quickly in such units, and while many crews expressed quiet admiration for what had been accomplished, no one treated the men as heroes in the sensational sense. They were regarded instead as examples of disciplined professionalism, airmen who had confronted a dire emergency with the seriousness and resolve expected in wartime. This manner of recognition suited them, as none sought personal glory. They understood that many crews had faced equally deadly circumstances and had not returned, and they carried that awareness with them into each subsequent mission. The crew's return to operational status coincided with a period of intensified Allied efforts to weaken enemy infrastructure ahead of major ground offensives. Missions grew more frequent, distances longer, and resistance increasingly desperate. Their new aircraft, though thoroughly inspected and equipped with the latest improvements available in the theater, could not eliminate the inherent dangers of the air war. Yet the crew resumed their duties with the same measured determination that had characterized their actions during the fire incident. They approached each mission briefing with quiet focus, carried out pre-flight procedures with habitual thoroughness, and maintained the practiced coordination built over countless hours in the air. One notable effect of the inversion incident was the heightened vigilance the crew maintained toward engine performance. They developed a more intuitive sense of the subtle vibrations, temperature fluctuations, and manifold readings that could indicate early signs of trouble. This sensitivity did not verge into paranoia, rather, it reflected the experience of men who had seen firsthand how small mechanical anomalies could become catastrophic without prompt attention. Their attentiveness contributed to the overall safety of subsequent missions and was occasionally cited by ground crews who appreciated the precision with which the crew reported even minor irregularities during post-flight debriefings. Over time, the inversion incident became a reference point not only for the men who lived through it but also for those who trained with or served alongside them. It illustrated that emergencies did not always follow predictable patterns and that survival often required decisions made under extreme pressure, grounded in both training and instinct. The story was sometimes recounted in mess halls, not as a boast but as a lesson in the unpredictable nature of aerial combat. Such recountings were passed quietly, avoiding exaggerated flourishes and preserving the gravity of what had occurred. Air crews understood that these stories served not entertainment but education, one more means of preparing themselves mentally for the uncertainties of flight. As the war progressed toward its final phases, the crew completed their tour of duty. The requirements for operational service varied among Allied nations, but for many bomber crews, the accumulation of a set number of missions signified eligibility for reassignment to training roles, ground support, or rotation back to their home countries. Meeting this threshold was no small achievement. Attrition rates throughout the air war had been high, and surviving a full tour required not only skill but also circumstances aligned with fortune. When the time came for the crew to conclude their combat operations, their departure from the squadron was marked with the customary mixture of relief, respect, and quiet reflection shared among airmen who understood all too well the cost paid by those who did not reach that milestone. Their subsequent assignments varied. A few returned to flight training establishments, where they instructed new cadets in the complexities of multi-engine aircraft and emergency procedures. They brought with them the pragmatic lessons of combat, reinforcing the importance of calm decisiveness and adaptability during crises. Their instruction emphasized not only the mechanics of flight but the necessity of teamwork and trust, qualities that had preserved their lives during the fire incident. Other members of the crew were reassigned to logistical or administrative roles within the Air Force, contributing to the war effort in capacities that, while less visible than frontline service, were essential to sustaining operational capability. For those who served as instructors, recounting the inversion incident required careful consideration. They avoided dramatization, presenting it instead as a case study in emergency response. The focus remained on the underlying principles: understanding airflow behavior, maintaining control under unusual attitudes, and making decisions rooted in both aeronautical knowledge and situational assessment. Their students listened attentively, aware that the instructors were drawing upon first-hand experience rather than theoretical scenarios. These lessons, preserved in the memories of those who received them, contributed to a broader culture of preparedness across training institutions. As the war drew to a close, the crew members gradually transitioned back into civilian life. This transition, like that of many veterans, was marked by a mixture of relief, uncertainty, and the challenge of reintegrating into a world profoundly changed by years of conflict. Some pursued careers in aviation, carrying forward the expertise gained during their service. They worked as pilots, mechanics, or engineers, helping to shape the rapidly expanding field of post-war civil aviation. Their wartime experiences instilled in them not only technical proficiency but also a deep respect for the limits of human and mechanical endurance, knowledge that proved invaluable in an era where air travel would soon become accessible to the public. Others sought entirely different paths, choosing professions unrelated to aviation. Yet even in these new careers, their wartime service left a lasting imprint. The discipline, resilience, and capacity for calm judgment under pressure that had defined their actions in the air became qualities that guided them throughout their lives. Their families, friends, and colleagues would come to recognize these traits without necessarily knowing their full origins. Many veterans spoke little of their wartime experiences, sharing details only when they felt the moment appropriate, and often only with those who showed genuine interest and respect. As decades passed, the inversion incident remained a deeply personal memory for the surviving crew members. Its significance was measured not by external recognition but by the simple fact that it had allowed them to return home, build families, and live out the years that might otherwise have been denied to them. In occasional reunions or correspondence, they reflected on that moment not with pride in their ingenuity but with gratitude for the outcome and a solemn awareness of the fragility of survival in wartime. They remained mindful that countless men had faced similar emergencies and had not returned. Historians who later examined the squadron records and personal accounts of the crew contextualized the incident within the broader narrative of the air war. They noted its rarity, its technical complexity, and its demonstration of exceptional airmanship. Yet they also emphasized that such actions, while extraordinary, were emblematic of a generation that confronted unprecedented challenges with quiet determination. The inversion maneuver belonged not to the realm of legend but to the lived reality of aircrews who navigated a world where danger was constant and the margin between life and death often measured in seconds. The documentation preserved in archives, while invaluable, cannot fully convey the sensory and emotional dimensions of the incident, the heat radiating from the burning nacelle, the disorienting pull of gravity during inversion, the strain on the aircraft structure, the focused vigilance of each crew member, and the immense relief upon landing. These elements, carried in memory rather than in official reports, shaped the way the crew understood their experience. Their accounts, shared sparingly over the years, provided insight into the human dimension of aerial warfare, an aspect often overshadowed by the scale of military operations. Toward the end of their lives, surviving members of the crew were occasionally interviewed by historians or family members seeking to understand the events of the war more deeply. In these interviews, the men approached the subject with the same measured tone they had maintained during the war. They described the inversion incident plainly, attributing the outcome to training, teamwork, and necessity rather than to personal heroism. They acknowledged the fear that had accompanied the emergency but emphasized that fear had not dictated their actions. Instead, discipline and trust in one another had guided them through the ordeal. Listeners often sought to draw lessons or symbolic meaning from the story, interpreting it as a testament to human ingenuity or courage. Yet the crew members themselves resisted such interpretations. They viewed the incident not as a moral tale but as a moment shaped by circumstance. Their humility reflected a broader ethos among veterans of the air war, who understood that survival often owed as much to conditions beyond their control as to their own actions. Nonetheless, their story carries enduring significance precisely because of this humility. It reveals how individuals in extraordinary situations made choices grounded in responsibility and a profound commitment to one another. In the years following the war, aviation technology advanced rapidly. Modern aircraft gained improved fire suppression systems, more robust structural designs, and redundant controls that reduced the likelihood of emergencies escalating to the level faced by the wartime crew. Yet even as technology progressed, the principles demonstrated by the inversion incident, clear judgment, disciplined execution, and reliance on collective expertise, remained integral to aviation culture. Flight safety programs often referenced historical incidents to illustrate the evolution of emergency procedures and the importance of adaptability. While the inversion maneuver was never promoted as a standard action, its place in aviation history served as a reminder that unforeseen circumstances could demand unconventional responses. As time continued its inexorable progression, the generation that had fought the Second World War grew older, their numbers gradually diminishing. Memorial events and commemorations provided opportunities to honor their service, and the stories of individual crews, once known only within narrow circles, became part of a broader effort to preserve the human experiences of the war. Among these stories, the account of the crew that inverted their aircraft to extinguish a fire found a quiet yet meaningful place. It exemplified the resourcefulness and resolve characteristic of airmen who faced immense dangers with composure and dedication. When the last surviving member of the crew eventually passed away, his family discovered among his belongings a small collection of wartime documents, service records, photographs, correspondence, and a meticulously kept logbook. Within the logbook, the entry describing the inversion incident was written with restrained precision, devoid of emotion yet charged with significance. Its concise description stood in contrast to the magnitude of what had occurred. The family, recognizing its importance, shared the documents with historians, ensuring that the details would be preserved for future generations. Today, the story endures as an example of extraordinary airmanship grounded in deeply human qualities. It reminds us that history is not solely shaped by grand strategies or large-scale operations but also by individual decisions made in moments of intense pressure. The crew's actions illustrate the capacity for calm thought in the face of overwhelming danger, the strength of trust forged among comrades, and the profound respect for life that motivated them to do everything in their power to save one another. In reflecting upon their experience, it becomes clear that the true significance of the incident extends beyond the technical feat of inverting an aircraft. Its meaning lies instead in the values that guided the crew: responsibility, discipline, humility, and an unwavering commitment to ensuring that no member was left behind. These qualities, expressed in that singular moment, defined their service during the war and shaped their lives afterward. The war itself has long since ended, but its lessons endure. Among them is the understanding that courage need not be loud or dramatic to be profound. Sometimes it appears in the steady hands of a pilot maintaining control of a damaged aircraft, in the unwavering focus of crew members performing their duties under extreme conditions, or in the quiet resilience carried through the years by those who survived. The inversion incident, preserved in records and memories, stands as a lasting testament to this kind of courage. And so the story concludes not with triumph in the traditional sense, but with gratitude, for the lives saved, for the years lived afterward, and for the enduring reminder that even in the darkest moments of war, human beings found ways to rise above fear with clarity, resolve, and dignity. It is a story that veterans could hear and affirm with simple truth, recognizing in it the spirit of those who served. Yes, that is how it was.